Well, good morning. Thanks for coming back. I'm glad that when I put you to sleep last night, you were able to wake up this morning. So thanks for coming once again. And today, as I mentioned last night, we move down in history to a period where we have much more direct archaeological evidence for things the Bible talks about. Yes. So please turn off every possible light, because with the sunlight outside, you're not seeing what I'm seeing on my laptop, so that's important. We think that David's such an important figure in the Bible, and in fact, I ran a quick word check in my Accordance Bible software. David is the most frequently mentioned person in the Bible, more than Moses, which is what surprised me. And clearly his role as the king and the prototype for the Messianic king vaults him up to a very specific place in Scripture. So I thought I would take a step backwards in time before David and look at the formation of Israel as a kingdom. You remember that when Joshua leads the people into the Promised Land is not conquered in its entirety. In fact, when you get to Joshua chapter 13, we read that now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and God said to him, "You are old and advanced in years." Love that, don't you? Especially when you're old and advanced in years. And it says, there is still much land to be possessed. When Joshua dies, the 12 tribes have parts of the land, but not all of the land that God promised to Abraham. So what I want to do is take a step back a century or so before the establishment of the kingdom of Israel and look at the circumstances going on in the world that helped. Some reason we're missing the very top line here. But anyway, above the word dormant, it should say that when we get to 1200 BC, this is the beginning of what is called the Iron Age. And in this time, the great empires of the Near East had collapsed. So the Hittites, who controlled what is today Turkey and down into what is today Lebanon, or Syria, right, the Lebanon-Syria border, that great empire, superpower that it was no more. The Egyptian empire that had battled the Hittites in what is again today Syria, Egypt had fallen into a position of weakness. Egypt was divided. It was no longer one powerful pharaoh ruling the whole. Rather, it were multiple kings with chunks of Egypt divided up, so they were no longer a world power. So larger kingdoms were replaced by smaller kingdoms, big empires by mini empires. And then there were some very important migrations. We still don't know the cause of these migrations, a little after 1200, around 1200. But there seems to have been some famines. There seems to have been some serious earthquakes in what is today Turkey. And we know from recent events how serious earthquakes in Turkey can be. But this precipitated the movement of people groups seeking food, seeking more stable place. And so the whole Near East between 1200 and 1100 was kind of in turmoil. And this is a migration that brought the Philistines into the picture. So here's your basic world empires as they had been, Egypt and the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and of course the Assyrians and the Babylonians will make a comeback in the first millennium. But there you are. This is a temple of the pharaoh Ramses III. Ramses III was sort of the last great pharaoh of Egypt. After him were many more kings. In fact, there were 6 more kings called Ramses, but Ramses III left us a magnificent temple, his funerary temple at Medinet Habu in western Thebes. And on this outside northern wall, it contains a most intriguing illustration that tells us about this group of peoples that invaded, came down the coast, and it mentions how they destroyed Hatti, the Hittites, Ugarit, different places, including Alicia, which is the island of Cyprus, which you can just barely see here, unfortunately, and they tried to enter Egypt. Among this group of 5 different tribes was one group called the Philistines, the Peleset. And they tried to come by land and by sea. And here you can see the boats of the Egyptian navy fighting against the Philistines and the other sea peoples. Here's a boat, here's a Philistine being dumped out of the boat. It's a magnificent scene. These are the Egyptian troops here with their helmets on, archers, etc. And a closer look at this Philistine being dumped out. And then on another wall, we have the great Ramses taking prisoners of war to present them as, if you will, living sacrifices to the god Amun-Re of Thebes. We zoom in. Oops, sorry, I'm missing the top. But these are Philistines. Sorry, I don't know why we're missing the top. But anyway, these are Philistines. Some of them ended up in Egypt as prisoners of war, and we saw what happened with prisoners of war last night in Egypt. But apparently, the majority of the population, rather than successfully invade Egypt, went back to Canaan and occupied the coastal area. In fact, going back to Joshua chapter 13, when it mentions all the areas yet to be conquered, it specifically mentions the area of the Philistines, which is the southern coast of, or pretty much today, what is the Gaza Strip. Okay, and of course, you may know that the word Philistine is where we get the word Palestine. Okay, the Philistines, the Palestinians. It's the same word. Not necessarily provable, it's the same people. Now, all of this to say that as we move towards the end of the book of Judges, we see increasingly the Philistines becoming a problem. They pop up as a problem in the story of Samson. They pop up as a problem during the reign of King Saul. In fact, the reason why in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people are fed up with this judge system, said, we want a king like other nations, and their main concern is that the king is a military officer. He leads the armies of Israel. Who was the judge at the time? A wonderful prophet named Samuel. Great prophet, great preacher, bad general. And they wanted somebody to go fight the Philistines. And now here, this map, you can see the area in pink is the area that, that constituted the kingdom or the territory of King Saul. Notice the area of Philistia, basically the coastal area, was not controlled by the Israelites. And the kingdom of Saul largely was between Dan in the north and Beersheba in the south. And Israel, again and again, as a tribe, is from Dan to Beersheba. And you'll notice in the middle here, a little white circle, and the name Jebus, which is the pre-Jerusalemite name of Jerusalem. The Jebusites lived there. So notice it's not pink, because it's not until David's time that Jerusalem is taken and added to his kingdom. So you can see all the territories that were yet to be conquered. And I'm building up to the fact that it's David who finally takes it all. David is the one who will finally conquer and reach the territorial boundaries as mentioned in the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 15. So Saul is as we know, a not very successful leader, primarily because of his own insecurities and his psychological problems and many things that we know about in reading 1 Samuel. And David, of course, enters into this picture as a young man, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But believe it or not, even though David is the most mentioned person in the Old Testament, there are people, historians, archaeologists, who questioned the historicity of David in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, I take you to the site of Dan, Tel Dan as we call it, Dan is the northern, sort of the, when you think of New York to LA, so this is like LA and Beersheba is like New York, the breadth of the nation. These are the walls of the ancient city of Dan, and that's me standing there some years ago. In the court area, as you enter the gate, in 1993, I was with a group of students from Wheaton College at the time, and we walked right over there into this gate and went into the city. In only a matter of weeks later, the archaeologists were working there, and one of the staff went by, and right where this block is, right here, an amazing discovery was made. It was an inscription. It was a broken inscription that had been recycled and was used as paving blocks in that quarter area. But the sun just struck it in such a way that she saw the Hebrew script, the archaic Hebrew script. And it was placed there by the king of Damascus when he conquered this area about the time of King Jehu, around 841 BC. And what's so striking is, and you can see the words here highlighted in white, it reads in Hebrew, Beit David, the house of David. And the way it's used is interesting because it's referring to Ahaziah, the king of Judah, and calling him the king of the house of David. Well, if there's a house of David, i.e. a Davidic dynasty, there must have been a David. And with this discovery, people quickly abandoned the more radical views about David. So David's story we know from the Bible. And again, I don't know, is there an adjustment I can make or you can make? I'm losing the top line of my text. Is there?
Probably a setting on your computer.
I apologize for this.
Okay.
Slide share.
What it is the dimensions of our projector are different than
Yes.
the resolution. It would be a resolution setting.
I don't know if you can figure it out, I'd appreciate it. So,
Keep going and I'll see what I can do.
okay. Yeah, you can see. So David's rise to power, the keys to his success. David is anointed the king, of course, by Samuel, and the Spirit of God leaves. Okay, here we go. I mean, it looks good. All right. We're cool. And notice this is an illustration from 1,000 years before the time of David, in which a priest is anointing the head of a person, probably another priest. Both priests and kings could be anointed, and it's a symbol of divine approval, as we know from the Bible. And of course, it's from there we get the word, the Messiah, the anointed one. So, one of David's first claim to fame was killing Goliath. And again, this is a story that's a wonderful Sunday school story, but from an ancient military perspective, one sees other issues at work. So let's just review these bullet points really quickly. It's simply reviewing how David became the great king. Number one, the Spirit of God comes on him. Just as the Spirit of God endowed the judges with leadership and ability to rule, now the Spirit of God comes on kings in a special way. So in Psalm 51, when David says, "Take not your Holy Spirit from me," he's not an Arminian debating with a Calvinist. This is the Spirit of God given to him at his anointing to be the king. It gave him authority to be the king. It has nothing to do with salvation. So when you sing that prayer, you shouldn't be worried about your salvation and say, "Take not your Holy Spirit from me." Although that's a good thing to pray. But anyway, that's not what's going on there. God had endowed him specially, as he had Saul. But when Saul disobeyed God perpetually, God removed his spirit, and he was tormented by an evil spirit. And that Spirit of God now came on David. And he becomes a national hero by killing Goliath. Again, we'll talk about that more. Another very important thing to his rise to power was his marriage to Saul's daughter. In the ancient Near East, the woman you marry and the next king is always connected to the mother. As you know, you can be identified as a Jew not based on your father, but your mother. So David was married to Michal, the daughter of Saul, and that's a very powerful combination when you have this guy who's the next king marrying into the dynasty already in place. We see him uniting the 12 tribes that had been scattered and not always, in fact, if you look at the final chapters, 4 chapters of the book of Judges, it talks about civil war, horrible things going on within Israel, and again we read the line, there was no king in Israel. There was no king in Israel. And everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And it's sort of an apologetic saying, we need a king. We need a leader who's going to pull this divided nation together. Sound familiar? And he unites the tribes because when Saul was king, the northern tribes all sided with Saul and wanted his successors to follow. But of course, Jonathan, the crown prince, died, and so it complicated things. And the other thing he's known for is really cooperating with the prophets, listening to the prophets, humbling himself before Nathan when he sinned, and so on. When we think of the story of David and Goliath, again, the picture of this little kid running with his slingshot or his sling, whatever comes to mind, we think perhaps that we're dealing with a little boy and his toy. But the reality is the sling was a lethal weapon. Now, what you see here are a group of Assyrian soldiers in 701 BC. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the next lecture. They're attacking the city of Lachish, one of the Judean cities of King Hezekiah. And you can visit these reliefs, beautiful reliefs, in the London Museum, British Museum, London. And here you see the archers with their bows and arrows firing up at the defenders on the city wall. And over here, these men, you can just see these lines going up. Unfortunately, the top of the picture is cut off. They're slingers. So they stand with the archers. And we can say something because city walls are frequently the place where a lot of the slinging happens in battles. And as one colleague told me, around city walls, sling ballista, and they're about the size, you can see these are about the size of a tennis ball maybe, and they're not pebbles, they're lethal, can fire up to 100 to 150 miles an hour within their effective range. And so when we think of David going after Goliath, you have to realize that David had 2 advantages. If you look at all the weapons that Goliath had, they're handheld for hand-to-hand combat. He's got a sword, he's got a spear, he's got a javelin, which is his only, we call it a medium-range weapon, but you have to be able to throw it. Whereas a sling, you can have a much greater range. David could stay out of range and knock Goliath off. So he also had mobility. He didn't have the cumbersome armor and so on and so forth. So these slings were very effective. And so what David did was amazing in its own right, but it's in a way militarily not a surprising defeat. I think it was a case that, it's like, do you remember? Of course you do. In Indiana Jones, at that one point when one of his detractors is trying to kill him, and he pulls out the sword and he's, I'm going to chop you up. And he pulls out his gun. Indiana Jones shoots the guy. It's kind of like that, okay? You got to draw the guy close before you can use your sword. And so that's what's going on. The area of Israel where this great battle took place, you can actually see the landmarks and the features of the terrain where the battle between the Philistines and the Israelites took place. Notice it takes place in the valley of Elah. When you hear the word valleys in Israel, valleys are always important because that's where your agriculture takes place. That's where your fields are. That's the most rich land. And so the very fact the Philistines are coming in to take the valleys is because they want it for agriculture. The Philistines lived on the coast. Even if you see pictures of Gaza Strip today, it's a very sandy area, not really that good for agriculture. So this is really a battle for an expanding Philistia, and we can see King Saul trying to stop it. Here we are on one side of the valley, and on the other side you can still see a seasonal stream. It's dry this time of year. During the winter months when it rains, you would have the stream, and this is where David would have picked up his stone. And when we took our student groups there, they'd all go grab a stone as a souvenir. And this happens so often, I think the Israeli government come by with dump trucks and dump stones out, so the next batch of tourists can grab a stone. One of the most exciting discoveries of the last 20 years has been the site called Khirbet Qiyafah. Qiyafah. Here's there's the Elah Valley, and we're standing on top of this hill where this site was found. This is an aerial shot from a balloon. You can see the cable that holds up the balloon that's taking the pictures looking down. But you can see this a walled city, and it used to be thought it was simply from Greek and Roman times. And when the team from Hebrew University began excavating, suddenly it was realized that this goes back to the 10th century. And what's interesting about it, you can see the walls of the city here, right here, and right here are two city gates. Here are the walls, what we call casemate walls with rooms attached to it. And for, 7, 8 years, students in our program were excavating there. Here's one of our students. This is a great big boulder they're moving, and they believe it was a stone that hit Goliath in the head. Okay, thank you, you got that. Here's looking down on the city gate. Notice it has 4 chambers. So this is the gate. And here's one of my students, Tom, Dr. Tom Middleton now. And he's standing in the gateway, give you a sense of the scale of this city. Now this fort overlooks the Elah Valley. Clearly, this is a Judean fort that was built to help monitor and defend against the Philistines. So it may well have been built by King Saul. And conceivably, it was here that the Israelite army was bivouacked until the battle with the Philistines. So maybe David strolled out of a gate like this to go down into the valley of Elah to take on Goliath. This is a potsherd with very faint Hebrew writing on it. One of the earliest Hebrew documents that's been discovered. It's very difficult to read, very difficult to translate, and scholars have had different interpretations of it. But it shows you that Hebrews occupied this from the language and the script. When David kills Goliath, the Philistines scatter, as we know the story, and the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath, which is one of the major Philistine cities, and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on their way from Sha'araim to Gath and Ekron. So where this all starts is a place called Sha'araim. Now, do I have, here we go, sorry, can't see my animations too well. Right here, remember, and over here, we have 2 gates. This is a relatively small walled city. And you know that the gate of a city is the most vulnerable point in attack. So you don't have lots of them. Typically in a site, you would have 1 gate. Here there are 2 in a relatively small fort. Question is why? The other point is that the Hebrew word Sha'araim means twin gates, 2 gates. So it is believed by the excavators that this is Sha'araim. This was the military headquarters of Saul, where David would have been when they took off and pursued the Philistines after David beat Goliath from Sha'araim down to Philistine territory, Ekron and Gath, their two major cities. So, so there's one gate, there's the other, and basically, if you see the way the gates are aligned, here's where the fort is. One basically is aligned to look down the valley this way, the other is aligned to look the valley this way. So they're strategically placed both for viewing access approaches, and also then they could dispatch troops to, if they needed, to this way or that, depending on where an attack was coming from. Again, here's the Elah Valley. So you have the Israelites, Judeans coming out this way, and the Philistines had been coming in that way. And that's the viewpoint of the two gates. So that's been one of the most interesting archaeological discoveries of the past 10, 15 years that has a direct effect, and it shows us that King Saul was already developing his kingdom and building defenses against the Philistines. And of course, David would have had a role and a presence there. So how did David build his mini empire? We walked through the steps of how he became a national hero. He killed the giant, and he married the daughter of Saul as one of the rewards for that. But as I said before, the previous great empires just weren't around anymore, and thus it was like there's a vacuum, and where there's a vacuum, something's going to fill it. And David's kingdom really is one of the things that filled control of this territory. David was engaged. He was a military man. We know that from when he was still a kid. I conjecture that because David wasn't in the army, remember last night, for those of you who are here, the age at which you can enter the army is 20. David had brothers who were conscripted. David was home taking care of the sheep. I take that to mean he was under 20, maybe in his mid to late teens. But he certainly wasn't a 10-year-old going after Goliath. He unites the tribes, which is a big deal. And then he, as I said, he claims for the first time the territory that God had designated to Abraham through his military conquest. And then he went beyond that into neighboring countries as well. So this map illustrates what Saul's kingdom, remember that pink kingdom from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. So here's Dan in the north, Beersheba in the south. And you can see how under David, the yellowish, brownish, green colored territory was all added to the kingdom of Israel by David through his military conquest, which included territory on the other side of the Jordan River. And you can see that Philistia still existed, but it was under the domination. It was a subservient state to Israel from David's time on. And it was reduced in size. And as we'll see a little bit later on, I want to point this out now because the map's up. I can't remember if I have one later, but I want to identify the site of Hatzor, and there's a little square there. Here is Gezer, little square there, Jerusalem, Megiddo right here, the little square there. I draw your attention to these because we'll be looking very briefly at those sites during Solomon's reign. David took the city of Jerusalem, we're told, when his general and his either his uncle or cousin Joab, it's interesting, the present defense minister of Israel is Yoav Galant, Joab. And so Joabs are good military people, I guess. This is the entrance to the Gihon Spring, the extension of which was Hezekiah's tunnel that we'll talk about. And I'm sure there's some people in this room who've gone through that. Anybody here gone through? Yeah, you've been there, done that. So that's the entrance. And apparently David's men were able to take the very well defended, Jerusalem was a small place, but because of the landscape and the walls, it was very hard to conquer. And so the best way, apparently, Joab climbed over a wall, which I'll show you a little bit later on, and into the city. And there is a shaft that goes up, and some believe that he went up that shaft. The other things that David did when he takes Jerusalem, he very wisely makes that the capital. David was a smart diplomat. He wasn't just a brute warrior. He was that, but he was a very shrewd diplomat. When he killed Goliath, what did he do with Goliath's head? Anybody remember that? It's at the end, very end of 1 Samuel 17. He took the head, the severed head of Goliath, and somehow deposited at the gate of the city of Jerusalem. It's like, what's that all about? And apparently, he was putting Jerusalem on notice. Look, I've killed this Philistine here. I'm coming after you next. He was warning them. You know the old horse head in the bed? Okay, you know what I'm talking about? It's sort of that. Okay. But he makes Jerusalem his political capital. And remember, Jerusalem had not been conquered by any tribe. It was neutral. It was right on the border of Benjamin and Judah. If you go back to Judges chapter 1, you will see that both the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Judah both tried to take Jebus, or Jerusalem, and both failed to occupy it. So it remained independent until David's time. Knowing it was an independent place, right on the line, right on the territory between the northern tribes and Judah in the south, he chose that neutral spot to make his capital, and thereby, again, avoiding the politics of, well, I'm going to make the capital Hebron because that was where David first ruled from as king. After the nation was united, he built Jerusalem, and he brought the Ark of the Covenant there. Remember that story well, thus making Jerusalem both the political capital and the religious capital, the cathedral of the country, if you will. But he also made political alliances with the Phoenicians, the kings of Tyre and Sidon. And the main interest there was that the Phoenicians can't produce enough food. And David and Solomon, for their building in Jerusalem, needed the cedar, the timber that the Phoenicians had. So it was a mutually beneficial alliance, a treaty between the two. So here is Jerusalem in recent times. And the area you see up here on the right, that's the Mount of Olives. This is the Temple Mount, more on that. And the area here in this oval area and a little bit to the right was the ancient city of David. Jerusalem was very small, but nevertheless, in the area right over in here, a very important discovery was made. This whole area was more fully exposed in archaeological work in the 1970s, but this very large stone-stepped structure, as it's called, which you can see here, has baffled archaeologists. And a lot of work has been done on it, a lot of excavations. But on top of that stepstone structure, the archaeologist Eilat Mazar, who sadly died a little over 2 years ago from cancer, but she excavated this area and found remains of a large building. And she also found city gates and walls on the north end of that. And so here is a model or a plan put together by the archaeologist / architect named Lane Rittmeyer. And what Rittmeyer did was to, here's ancient Jerusalem, here's this stepstone structure, and this was David's palace, I believe. And to the north of it is the area that David purchased, the Aruna threshing floor, where the temple would later be built. So here's then another vantage point where you see the stepstone structure, David's palace, the rest of the city, and this walled area with the tower down here is where the Gihon Spring was protected. The most vital thing for Israel, of course, or for Jerusalem, was its water source. So here you can see Rittmeyer's reconstruction of this. So it's very clear that what we have is either the Jebusite palace that David moved into when he took the city, or this was a palace actually built by David. There was some dispute because dating things that might only be 20, 30 years apart is very difficult to do. Archaeology is too small. Okay, let's move on. The temple, of course, is to the north. Here's the area we've just been talking about. See how small it is. Here's the Temple Mount of today. And the question now becomes, is it really 10:15 already? Okay. Okay, I'm going to very quickly wrap this up in 5 minutes so you can have your coffee break. Oh, no. Yeah, we started at 9:30. Okay, I'm good. I thought we were starting at 9 o'clock. That's why. Okay. I got a little more time, right, David?
Yes.
I'm doing okay.
2 more minutes.
30 more minutes? So David we think of as a conqueror, but a shrewd diplomat who established the kingdom, reached the borders that God had promised to Abraham, and now it was Solomon's task to maintain it. He did so largely using the Reagan doctrine of peace through strength and diplomacy. Those are the two things. He had a very strong military. He established chariotry. David never did. In fact, when David conquered up in Syria, he captured the chariotry of the Damascus king, and it said he hamstrung the horses. He didn't know what to do with them. He didn't have chariots. Up in the hill country in Jerusalem, chariots don't work very well in mountainous areas. In the plain, yes, they do. But Solomon saw the wisdom of adding a chariotry to his. He was an economic, shrewd operator, operating as a middleman between Egypt and the northern areas of Syria, where he was a middleman in horse and chariot trade. And of course, he aligned with the Phoenicians and established the port on the Gulf of Aqaba at what is present-day Eilat. And from there, Phoenician ships under the flag of Israel were going down into Africa and Arabia to bring back all kinds of exotic goods like incense and other things like, it specifically mentions monkeys and other exotic animals and so on. And of course, Solomon builds a temple. So we're going to talk about all these things. This is a very interesting painting of Edward Poitner, who, this is in the museum in I believe it's Sydney or Melbourne, I can't remember, in Australia, where the Queen of Sheba is coming up to meet King Solomon. But as I mentioned before, those cities, we're told specifically in 1 Kings chapter 9, that Solomon built defense cities, chariot cities, Jerusalem, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. It specifically mentions those. And what's interesting is that Gezer, Hatzor, Megiddo, archaeologists have uncovered the gates, and they're all made according to the same plan. They have 6 compartments rather than 4, so a little more sophisticated and larger than one Saul would have built. And these were the main defense point for the city, of course. So the very fact that these 3 cities are mentioned specifically in 1 Kings chapter 9, I think it's verse 27, that clearly this is part of an architectural plan. They're using the same blueprints. And again, this points to a centralized king who is giving the orders and things are being done according to those plans. So again, there's no inscriptions on these saying built by Solomon, but when you combine what we actually have in the ground with what the scripture describes, we have a very nice intersection. So, yeah. The temple, of course, I showed you this picture last night from the ESV Study Bible, was the crowning achievement of Solomon. And it is believed that the temple stood somewhere in the great walled area of what the Arabs call the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. But this is where the temple was. That is Solomon's temple, the second temple of Zerubbabel, Herod's temple, built one right after the other. People have debated. Some think, oh, the temple was right here where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is. Others have suggested it was over here. And the view that I follow is that the Holy of Holies is under the Dome of the Rock. And here's a closer look at the beautiful Dome of the Rock. It's very hard to get into it, and if they do let you in, they don't let you take pictures. So it's very difficult to get pictures. But back, I think it was 1913, during the end of the Ottoman Empire, a German engineer was able to get in and take some photographs, do some measurements. There are some more recent photographs. But when we look at the description, and I'll show you a picture of the inside of the dome in a moment, the plan of the temple, Solomon's temple, we know follows the same pattern that we have with the tabernacle. That is, there's the entrance area, there's the holy place, and the Holy of Holies, this tripartite structure. And a number of temples from the Iron Age, that is from 1200 down to about 600, exhibit the same sort of architectural plan. Now, again, that may trouble some people. What do you mean Solomon's temple looks like these other temples? God gave him the plan, but he also utilized Phoenician workers and architects. So it's not surprising that the Phoenician influence would come through. This is a temple that's found in Syria at a site called Tel Tayanat, right on the border with Turkey. It was excavated by one of my students. Now he's the director of the Near Eastern Studies program at the University of Chicago. But you see here the steps up, there is a pillar here. This is the outer entrance. This is the holy place and the Holy of Holies. Fascinatingly enough, when they were excavating the Holy of Holies, what did they find? They found the remains of several treaty texts between the Assyrian king Esarhaddon and the local prince, Esarhaddon, the great Assyrian emperor, which illustrates that the treaty texts between kings were deposited in the most sacred space in the kingdom. And of course, this is exactly what God is doing with the covenant he makes with Israel. Where is it? The Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. So the most holy place where God there is to witness and watch over his word to fulfill it. So interesting to see this architecturally. Another temple in Syria, which I understand was experienced a lot of destruction during the Syrian civil war, a beautiful temple called Ain Dara. And here's the plan of it. Again, you have the two pillars, the steps to the entrance area, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. So the exact same architectural pattern. Now, here we are inside the Dome of the Rock, and I'm following the work of Lane Rittmeyer. Rittmeyer was the archaeologist and an architect who did those plans of David and the city of David that we were looking at moments ago. Again, I wish this was a little clearer, but here's a view looking down on this rock. It's called the Dome of the Rock for a reason. There's a rock in there. Now, in the Islamic tradition, it's on this rock that Muhammad vaulted into heaven, not in the Quran, but the Hadith, up into this nocturnal revelatory journey that he took between Mecca and Jerusalem. And interestingly enough, as you may know, Jerusalem is never mentioned in the Quran. It's only in this Hadith tradition. But anyway, if you look down, okay, there is a square rectangular niche there, which, sorry, I can't see it so well here. But what Rittmeyer believes is that this was actually the Holy of Holies, that it was a little more elevated, natural stone, and because we know that you went up steps or up a ramp, because the Holy of Holies was a little higher. And so when you go into the temple, each stage gets a little bit higher. And so this is his reconstruction, and where the wall of the temple was, And this perfectly aligns with this rectangular slot cut into the rock, which is exactly the size of the Ark of the Covenant. So the Ark of the Covenant would have sat in this little niche. I think he's right. Again, you can't prove it. There's no inscription saying the Ark of the Covenant was here, written 3,000 years ago. So, but we can deduce based on what we have, the facts on the ground with the descriptions of the Bible. So here's David's Jerusalem, what we looked at, and it's this hill, the hill of Ophel, area in between here and then what is called Mount Zion, that is expanded to include Solomon's temple. In Hezekiah's day, it'll expand over to occupy all of this area too. So this is where the king was, and then more of the kings and who knows what all was going on there, but it's a good picture of what was going on. So when Solomon dies, it all falls apart. It all falls apart. And this nation that had achieved the boundaries of the Abrahamic covenant is now reduced to two small kingdoms, and suddenly the nations that had been under David's and Solomon's authority now are independent, and they're back on the map with their own kingdoms. And of course, the northern kingdom will be taken into captivity and occupied by foreigners and mixed-race people, hence the Samaritans, and Judah will hang on for a little while longer, and that's what we'll be talking about in the next talk.